Warmaster Kaross Dreth had killed his first enemy at the age of 4, in a creche arena built specifically so that Vorrin children could learn, before their bodies had even finished their first growth cycle, that mercy was a resource spent only on the already defeated. By the time he commanded the Dominion's 7th Legion, 200 years and 11 campaigns later, he had never once faced an infantry force he considered worth remembering by name. The galaxy's other conquered species fought with discipline or desperation, or the occasional flash of tactical brilliance quickly ground down by superior numbers. None of them had ever made him laugh. Humans made him laugh in the beginning. He watched the first intercepted broadcasts from the human homeworld, grainy footage of infantry drilling in mud, carrying weapons that fired solid metal projectiles propelled by burning powder, wearing armor that stopped shrapnel and little else, and he genuinely believed, for the length of that first briefing, that the Dominion scouts had made an error. No species reached the threshold of interstellar contact still fighting wars this way. The Vorrin themselves had not fought with unaugmented flesh in 11,000 years. Every Vorrin soldier who dropped onto a battlefield was gene-forged from conception for exactly that purpose, vat-grown, neurally tuned, chemically stabilized against fear, exhaustion, and the specific cruelty of doubt, engineered from birth to need nothing from the battlefield except orders and resupply. A human soldier, by grotesque comparison, was simply a person. Someone's child, pulled from an ordinary life, handed a rifle, and told to hope. The galaxy agreed with Kaross's assessment before a single Vorrin boot touched human soil. 3 other client species of the Dominion, invited to observe the coming campaign as a demonstration of Vorrin supremacy, filed amused diplomatic notes speculating on how many hours the human ground forces would survive contact. A broadcast entertainment network from the Threll Compact, itself long since absorbed into the Dominion's sprawling sphere of tributary worlds, ran a satirical program depicting human infantry as small, panicked mammals fleeing before the mere shadow of Vorrin armor. It was briefly the most popular program in that sector of space. Nobody watching it imagined they would eventually be forced to stop laughing, or that the reason would have a name. The 71st Regiment, 3rd Battalion, and in particular the 412 human beings who would come to be known, imprecisely but permanently, across a dozen languages, as the last battalion. The Vorrin themselves did not consider their contempt cruelty. It was simply, to them, an accurate reading of 11,000 years of unbroken evidence. Every species the Dominion had ever encountered fell into one of 2 categories once its infantry met Vorrin armor in the field. Those disciplined enough to surrender quickly, sparing their populations the worst of a ground campaign, and those too proud or too disorganized to do so, who were ground down over weeks instead of days and remembered, afterward, mainly as cautionary case studies in military academies. No species had ever fallen into a 3rd category, because the Dominion's war colleges had never needed to imagine one. Kaross had taught those academies himself for 2 decades between campaigns, standing before rows of gene-forged cadets barely out of their creche cycles, explaining that courage without augmentation was simply fear given a slightly longer clock before it inevitably ran out. He believed it completely, the way a person believes anything confirmed by every experience they have ever personally had. Ashvale would be the first experience of his considerable career that failed, at every turn, to confirm it. Human command structures, scattered and quarrelsome as they remained even a decade into the war, had no illusions of their own about how the galaxy viewed them. General Okoro Dunladi, coordinating what remained of Earth's Unified Defense Council from a Bunker 3 systems from Ashvale, had watched the Threll Compact's satirical broadcast himself, translated and forwarded by an intelligence officer who had thought, correctly, that the general would want to see exactly how little the rest of the galaxy expected of the people about to hold Ashvale's northern valley. Dunladi did not order a formal response. He simply forwarded the footage, without comment, to every unit commander preparing to deploy to the colony, including Colonel Sarah Whitlock, who watched it twice in the privacy of her own quarters the night before her battalion shipped out, and felt something colder and steadier settle into her than either fear or anger, the specific, quiet resolve of a soldier who has just been shown, in perfect clarity, exactly what she will be required to prove wrong. The invasion began the way Vorrin invasions always began, with overwhelming, almost ceremonial force. Kaross brought 2 full legions to the human colony world of Ashvale, a mining settlement of 11 million people that the Dominion's strategic assessment rated as militarily insignificant and geologically valuable, and he expected the ground campaign to be finished within a Vorrin week. Orbital bombardment cracked the planet's thin defense grid in the first 6 hours. Vorrin dropships descended in formations so precise they looked, from the ground, like a single vast and deliberate machine, rather than 80,000 individual soldiers. Colonel Sarah Whitlock watched that descent from a ridge above Ashvale's northern mining valley, through binoculars that had belonged to her grandfather in a war fought on Earth 2 centuries earlier, and felt the specific, cold clarity that came, she had learned, only in the moments before something became unfixably real. Her battalion held 412 soldiers, dug into terrain they had spent 3 frantic weeks fortifying once Ashvale's early warning sensors confirmed the Dominion fleet's approach. She had no illusions about what 412 human infantry, however dug in, could do against 2 Vorrin legions. She had told her officers, the night before, exactly what she believed their job actually was. "We're not going to win this battle," she said, in a command tent lit by a single failing lantern, to a circle of faces she had known for years and expected, with the flat certainty of a soldier who has done this math before, not to see again by the campaign's end. "Nobody expects us to. I don't expect us to. What I expect is that every hour we survive is an hour Ashvale's evacuation convoys get further from this valley, and every Vorrin soldier we make fight for that hour is a soldier who isn't chasing civilians instead. That's the whole job. Hold, however we can, for as long as we can, and make them remember they had to work for it." Private Devin Marsh, 22 years old and 11 weeks removed from a farm outside what had once been Manitoba, did not find that speech reassuring, and did not expect to. He had joined the planetary militia the week Ashvale's sensors first confirmed an incoming Dominion fleet, not out of any particular courage, he would have said if asked, but because the alternative, waiting in a bunker for someone else to decide whether he lived, had seemed somehow worse than dying doing something. He carried, in a pocket sewn into his fatigues by his mother 2 nights before he shipped out, a photograph of his family that he had not yet worked up the courage to look at since the shelling started, because he suspected, correctly, that looking at it now would make his hands shake too badly to hold a rifle. The first engagement lasted 4 hours and cost the battalion 61 soldiers. It cost the Dominion, by Kaross's own after-action estimate, considerably less than that, a bloody, humiliating, but tactically insignificant exchange that should have ended, by every metric his doctrine recognized, in a rout. It did not end in a rout. The battalion held its ridge, fell back to a second prepared position under covering fire that Kaross's tactical officer described, with visible confusion, as unusually coordinated for an unaugmented force, and kept fighting. Devin Marsh spent most of those 4 hours doing very little that he would later describe as heroic. He fired when he was told to fire, moved when the soldier beside him, a sergeant named Okafor, who had spent 19 years in the militia before the war made rank meaningless in the face of what was coming, grabbed his shoulder and physically hauled him toward the second position. He remembered, more than the fighting itself, the strange, almost embarrassing ordinariness of most of it, the way his hands did shake, exactly as he had feared they would, and the way Sergeant Okafor did not mock him for it, only checked twice that he still had ammunition left, as though shaking hands and a working rifle were not remotely mutually exclusive. It was the first thing Devin learned about the kind of war this was actually going to be, that fear and function were not opposites, whatever the recruitment posters back home had implied, and that most of what kept a person moving through the worst 4 hours of their life, so far, was not the absence of terror, but simply the next soldier over deciding not to leave without them. Kaross reviewed the engagement footage twice that evening, alone in his command tent, looking for the tactical error his soldiers had surely made to allow a rabble of unmodified flesh to inflict even the modest losses they had. He did not find one. What he found instead, watching a human medic, a woman named Priya Agrawal, 26, who had been training to be a nurse before the war rendered that distinction meaningless, drag a wounded soldier 40 meters under sustained fire to a position with no tactical value, except that it was closer to cover, was something his doctrine had no immediate category for. The soldier she saved was combat ineffective for the rest of the engagement. By any calculation the Vorrin military had ever taught him, the effort was wasted resource allocation. Kaross found himself, uncomfortably, unable to dismiss it as merely wasted. He did not yet understand what he was watching. He would spend the rest of the campaign learning, at considerable cost, exactly what it was. The Vorrin advance through Ashvale's northern valley slowed from a ceremonial march into something closer, humiliatingly, to a grind. The Third Battalion did not fight the way Kaross's doctrine expected an infantry force to fight, did not mass for a decisive engagement it could not win, did not attempt the single glorious stand that every conquered species eventually attempted, out of either pride or despair, before finally breaking. It scattered, regrouped, ambushed, withdrew, dug in again, ambushed again, in a pattern that should have exhausted itself within a day, and instead simply continued, day after day, as though the soldiers fighting it had access to some resource Kaross's sensors could not detect and his officers could not explain. His officers, in fact, had begun to explain it in ways Kaross found increasingly difficult to tolerate. A junior commander named Vesic Thorn, reviewing the third week of stalled advance with the particular contempt of a soldier bred never to know failure, suggested openly that the human resistance must be receiving some form of external support, stimulants, neural enhancement, technology the Dominion's intelligence had somehow failed to detect. Kaross privately suspected the truth was worse and stranger, and said nothing about it in the official reports, because he did not yet trust himself to put it into words his superiors would accept, that the humans were not enhanced at all. They were simply unmodified, doing what his own soldiers could not do without their support structures, continuing to function, to think, to fight, under conditions of sustained deprivation, injury, and fear that Vorrin physiology and psychology had been engineered, across 11,000 years, to never have to encounter. What Vesic Thorn's theory could not account for, because no Vorrin sensor was built to measure it, was the ordinary, unglamorous machinery of human endurance that kept the Third Battalion functioning through its third and fourth weeks of retreat. It was not stimulants. It was Sergeant Okafor rationing the last of the battalion's coffee, an absurd, almost embarrassing luxury to still be defending, and yet the single most fought-over resource in the camp. 1 cup at a time to soldiers who had not slept properly in 9 days, because he had learned, across 19 years of a much smaller, much quieter war before this one, that morale was not a mystical resource but a series of small, deliberate choices repeated until they became habit. It was Priya Agarwal teaching 3 soldiers with no formal medical training how to pack a wound well enough to keep a comrade alive for the 2 hours it might take a real medic to reach them, because she had done the arithmetic on how many medics the battalion had left and did not like the answer. None of it would have shown up on a Vorrin sensor sweep as strength. All of it, together, was the reason the battalion had not yet broken. He tested the theory quietly in the 4th week by ordering a full logistics interdiction against a Vorrin company operating at the edge of its supply chain, isolated for 6 hours from resupply and medical support. The company's combat effectiveness collapsed within 90 minutes. Soldiers bred to never feel true hunger, true exhaustion, true unmanaged fear, had no internal architecture for enduring circumstances in which those things simply happened anyway. Kaross ended the test early, troubled by results he had not expected and did not enjoy having confirmed. The 3rd Battalion, meanwhile, had begun doing something Kaross's intelligence officers initially misread as random harassment, but eventually, with growing unease, recognized as a coherent doctrine of its own. Small teams, never more than a dozen soldiers, moving without the heavy support structures Vorrin infantry considered non-negotiable, struck isolated Dominion supply lines at irregular intervals, then vanished into terrain their own months of retreat had taught them better than any Vorrin sensor sweep could map. Sergeant Okafor led one of the first of these raids himself, a strike against a resupply convoy 3 kilometers behind the Vorrin advance, and returned with exactly what the battalion actually needed most: medical supplies, ammunition compatible with salvaged Vorrin small arms, and almost as an afterthought, the first confirmation that Vorrin soldiers cut off from their support structures for even a few hours began, measurably, to falter. He reported the observation to Colonel Whitlock in 4 flat sentences that would, months later, form the basis of the tactical assessment she carried into every subsequent engagement of the campaign. They don't need to be beaten in a straight fight. They need to be made to fight without everything they've been built to depend on. Do that consistently enough, and the fight becomes something closer to fair than anyone on either side had believed possible at the campaign's outset. He requested and received permission to interview a captured human soldier, a rare event, since the 3rd Battalion's wounded were, more often than not, retrieved by their own before Vorrin patrols could reach them, another detail Kaross's doctrine struggled to metabolize. The soldier brought before him was Private Devon Marsh, captured unconscious after a collapsed trench buried him for 6 hours, recovered only because a Vorrin patrol happened across the site before the battalion's own recovery team could return for him. Devon, restrained in a containment field and still recovering from a head wound, that made the translation lattice's voice arrive to him half a second delayed, answered Kaross's question honestly, because 6 hours buried under a collapsed trench had left him with very little patience left for strategic caution. "Why do you keep fighting a battle you cannot win?" Kaross asked. "Your officers must know the outcome is already decided." "Maybe," Devon said. "But nobody in that valley signed up because they thought we'd win. We signed up because somebody had to buy the convoy's time, and it turned out that somebody was us. You keep asking why we don't stop when it gets bad. I don't think you understand. For most of us, it was already bad back home, in 100 smaller ways, long before you showed up. We're used to things being hard and staying upright anyway. That's not a weapon your scientists installed in us. That's just what most of us had to learn how to do to get through an ordinary life." Kaross did not have a response to that. He dismissed Devon back to containment and sat alone afterward for a long time, turning the answer over, recognizing in it something his own soldiers, bred for 11,000 years to never need to answer such a question, would never be able to give him, because they had never once been asked to develop it. His superiors did not share his growing unease. Grand Marshal Vorrin Dominion, overseeing the Ashvale campaign from orbit, viewed the stalled advance not as evidence of anything worth understanding, but as an embarrassment requiring immediate correction. He had watched the satirical broadcasts mocking human fragility with the rest of the galaxy, and he had staked considerable personal prestige on Ashvale, concluding as a swift, contemptuous demonstration, rather than the grinding month-long humiliation it had become. He ordered, over Kaross's private and unrecorded objection, the deployment of the Dominion's cleansing fire protocol against the Third Battalion's final confirmed position, an orbital thermal barrage powerful enough to sterilize 11 square kilometers of terrain down to bedrock, a weapon the Dominion reserved for targets it wished not merely defeated, but erased so completely that no story could survive to be told about them. Kaross argued against it, in terms as close to insubordination as his career had ever risked. "They are 400 soldiers, not a fortress," he told the Grand Marshal, over a calm link he suspected was already being reviewed for signs of exactly the doubt he was expressing. "Erasing them changes nothing tactically. It only ensures the galaxy remembers that we needed a weapon built to kill cities in order to finish a battle against 400 people with rifles." The Grand Marshal's answer arrived with the flat, absolute confidence of a career that had never once required revision. "Then let the galaxy remember that we finished it. That is the only lesson that has ever mattered." Vorrin Dominion had not risen to command the Dominion's Northern War effort by tolerating campaigns that dragged past their projected timelines, and Ashvale had, by his own private reckoning, become the single most expensive embarrassment of his career, not in ships or soldiers, which the Dominion could replace without difficulty, but in the currency he valued more: the certainty, cultivated across a dozen client worlds over decades, that Vorrin supremacy was not a claim requiring proof, only a fact requiring occasional demonstration. A month-long stalemate against 400 unaugmented infantry was not a demonstration. It was the first crack in a foundation he had spent his entire career treating as bedrock, and he intended to seal it the only way his doctrine had ever taught him to seal anything: with overwhelming, unambiguous, unanswerable force. The barrage fell on the 3rd Battalion's confirmed position at what Ashvale's remaining civilian population would later describe, in testimony gathered long after the war ended, as false dawn, a second sun rising in the wrong direction, silent for 4 full seconds before the sound arrived, and by the time the sound arrived, the Northern Valley Sarah Whitlock's battalion had spent a month defending had already ceased, for all practical purposes, to exist as terrain. The broadcast networks that had mocked human fragility months earlier carried the bombardment live across a dozen client worlds, framed, at the Grand Marshal's explicit instruction, as a demonstration rather than an atrocity, proof, delivered to every species still quietly wondering whether the stalled Ashvale campaign meant something, that the Dominion remained capable of erasing whatever it chose to erase. For 6 hours afterward, Dominion sensors confirmed no surviving movement in the bombardment zone. Kaross stood in his command tent reviewing thermal imagery of ground that had been, that morning, for 112 human lives, and felt something he did not have Vorrin vocabulary for and privately suspected, from his interview with Devon Marsh, might be closest to what humans called grief, not for an enemy defeated, but for a question he would now never get to finish asking. He was wrong about the 6 hours. He would spend the rest of his life being grateful he was wrong. What Kaross's sensors could not detect, and what the Grand Marshal's overwhelming confidence had never once considered worth investigating, was that the 3rd Battalion had not held its confirmed position for 11 days. Sarah Whitlock, watching the pattern of Vorrin reconnaissance sweeps with the particular attention of an officer who had learned, over a month of grinding retreat, exactly how her enemy thought, had ordered her battalion into the valley's old mining tunnels 4 days before the barrage fell, kilometers of excavated rock, unmapped in any Dominion survey because Ashvale's mining company had gone bankrupt digging them and never filed the final geological reports. She left behind exactly enough surface activity, decoy transmissions, deliberately sloppy patrol patterns, to keep Dominion sensors confident they had the battalion's position confirmed. It was not a clever trick built in a moment of inspiration. It was the same instinct that had kept the battalion alive for a month of impossible odds, the same instinct Devon Marsh had tried, haltingly, to explain to Kaross in a containment field. When the fight in front of you cannot be won honestly, you find the version of the fight that can. 406 of them survived the barrage, sealed under 100 meters of bedrock while the surface above them turned to glass. 23 died in the days that followed anyway, collapsed tunnels, contaminated water, wounds that field medicine could not fully answer, the ordinary grinding attrition of survival rather than the dramatic violence of battle. Priya Agarwal, who had trained to be a nurse before the war made the distinction meaningless, spent those days doing the unglamorous, unrecorded work that never made it into any broadcast. Rationing antibiotics, setting bones by lamplight, sitting with soldiers who did not survive the night so that none of them, whatever else happened, had to die entirely alone. Sarah Whitlock did not sleep more than 2 hours at a stretch for the 11 days the battalion spent underground, and later, when asked how she had held 400 frightened, injured, half-starved people together in the dark beneath a planet the enemy believed they had already erased, gave an answer almost identical, without either of them ever comparing notes, to the one Devon Marsh had given his captor weeks earlier. We were already used to holding on through things that should have broken us. The tunnels were just the latest version of that. Devon Marsh had not been in the tunnels for that decision. He had still been in Vorrin custody, recovering from the head wound that made the translation lattice arrive to him half a second delayed, unaware that the battalion he had been captured out of was, at that very moment, still alive kilometers beneath a valley the entire galaxy had been told no longer held anyone at all. He learned of it only when his own containment field went dark without explanation on the 11th day, and a Vorrin guard he had not previously spoken with told him, in a voice Devon could not quite read through the lattice's flattened translation, that the campaign status had changed and he would be released within the hour. He would not learn until much later that the guard's strange tone had been something closer to relief than duty, that even among the soldiers assigned to hold him, word of what was rumored to be walking out of the glassed valley had already begun, quietly to travel. There was no single dramatic moment in the tunnels that Sarah Whitlock would later point to as the reason the battalion, held together rather than fracturing under the weight of 11 days in the dark. It was, she would say, mostly 1,000 small ones, a private sharing the last of a ration bar with a stranger from a different company because the stranger's own supply had run out 2 days earlier, a soldier singing, badly and half under his breath, an old song from a country most of the others in that tunnel had never visited, because the silence had become worse than the imperfect singing. None of it looked like strategy. All of it, added together across 11 days, was the only strategy that had ever mattered. They emerged on the 12th day at dusk, into a landscape the bombardment had turned to black glass and ash. 389 soldiers walking out of ground the entire galaxy had been told, on a broadcast watched by billions across a dozen worlds, no longer contained anyone at all. A Vorrin patrol found them first, and the patrol's own sensor logs, recovered, translated, and eventually broadcast back across the same networks that had carried the bombardment as triumph, captured the exact, disbelieving silence of soldiers who had been told this battle was already finished. Watching 400 human beings walk out of a wasteland their own doctrine insisted could not have left anyone alive to walk out of it. The patrol did not immediately open fire. Its commander would later testify, in the confused aftermath of a war whose ending nobody in the Dominion had actually planned for, that he had simply been unable, in the moment, to process what his sensors were confirming clearly enough to give the order. The patrol commander, a young officer named Rasik von barely 3 campaigns into his career, had grown up on the same satirical broadcasts that had mocked human fragility across a dozen client worlds, and had genuinely, uncomplicatedly believed them. the way young soldiers believe anything repeated often enough by everyone around them. What he watched instead, 389 figures picking their way across glass and ash that still radiated heat through the soles of their boots, supporting each other over ground too unstable to walk alone, moving not with the desperate scattered panic his training had prepared him to expect, but with the exhausted, deliberate cohesion of people who had simply decided, individually and then collectively, that stopping was not yet an option, did not match any frame his mind had available for it. He held his patrol's fire not because regulation required it, but because some part of him, watching, had already understood before his conscious thought caught up to it, that he was witnessing something his own species' entire military doctrine had no honest answer for. Kaross received the report in his command tent, and did not, for several long minutes, respond at all. He had spent 11 days composing, in his own private log, the beginning of a formal account of the Third Battalion's destruction, an honest account, more honest than the Grand Marshal's, one that had tried imperfectly to explain to future Vorrin officers why 400 unmodified soldiers had cost his forces a month and considerable prestige before finally, mercifully, being ended. He had not finished writing it. He would never need to. He went to the reconnaissance line himself, breaking protocol that dictated a Warmaster of his rank did not personally verify contested field reports, and stood at the edge of the glassed valley as the sun set over ground that had been, 12 days earlier, the most thoroughly erased position in the Dominion's recent military history. He watched Sarah Whitlock walk toward the Vorrin line at the head of her surviving battalion, unarmed, having ordered every weapon left behind in the tunnels rather than risk the ambiguity of an armed approach being read as an attack. She stopped 20 meters from Kaross, close enough that the translation lattice carried her voice without static, and said the only thing that seemed, to her, worth saying to the officer whose weapon had failed to end them. "You spent a month trying to convince yourselves that fear would break us the same way it breaks you," she said. "It might, eventually. I'm not going to pretend none of us are afraid. But we don't get to stop just because we're afraid. Most of us never have. I think that's the part your weapons couldn't reach." Kaross did not answer immediately. He was aware, standing there, of every Vorrin soldier on that line watching him, waiting to learn from his response what the last month of their lives had actually meant. He thought of Devon Marsh's answer in the containment field, of Priya Agarwal dragging a wounded stranger 40 meters under fire for no tactical reason his doctrine could justify, of 11,000 years of Vorrin soldiers bred never to need an answer to the question this small, exhausted, unbroken woman had just given him without being asked. "No," he said finally, in his own voice rather than through the lattice, close enough that she could hear the Vorrin beneath the translation. "I don't think it could." The Ashvale campaign ended within the week, not through Dominion victory or human capitulation, but through something the galaxy's broadcast networks, so eager months earlier to mock a species they assumed would break on contact, had no easy language to summarize. An armistice negotiated in the field by a Warmaster who returned to his own command structure and reported, against the Grand Marshal's explicit wishes, that the campaign's continuation would cost the Dominion more than any mining colony could ever be worth to recover it. Ashurin Vec would spend the rest of his career disputing that assessment. He would not survive the political fallout of the footage. Sarah Whitlock's unarmed approach, Kaross's answer, the sight of 389 soldiers walking out of ground he had personally certified as erased, reaching audiences across a dozen worlds that had, until that week, only ever seen humans portrayed as something to laugh at. The council that eventually reviewed Ashurin Vec's conduct did not remove him from command, because the bombardment itself violated Dominion law. It did not, and no one seriously argued that it had. They removed him because he had certified, in writing on the record, across every channel the Dominion's client worlds could access, that the Third Battalion no longer existed, and had been proven, in the most public and unanswerable way available to any galactic power, simply wrong. 11,000 years of unbroken Vorrin certainty had never once required the Dominion to develop institutional language for correcting a public failure of that magnitude. The Council's final ruling, when it came, borrowed uncomfortably, deliberately, from the vocabulary of the very species whose survival had made the ruling necessary in the first place, an acknowledgement, however reluctant, that some mistakes could not be unmade simply by insisting loudly enough that they had never happened. The satirical broadcast stopped airing within days. Nobody in the Dominion sphere of client worlds ever formally announced why. They simply, quietly disappeared from the schedules, replaced by a different kind of coverage entirely, analysis, cautious, and increasingly respectful, of a species that other cultures across the galaxy had spent months mocking for its apparent fragility, and had learned, in the space of a single broadcast, to describe instead by a different word, one that traveled, imperfectly translated, into a dozen languages that had never before needed it applied to something so small and so young. Unbreakable. Devon Marsh went home to what remained of his family's farm outside the ruins of Ashvale's northern settlements, and did not, for a long time, look at the photograph his mother had sewn into his fatigues, not because he was afraid of it anymore, but because he had finally understood, standing in the ash of a valley the galaxy had been told no longer held anyone at all, exactly what he had been carrying it for. He unfolded it for the first time in almost 2 months on the transport home, sitting beside Sergeant Okafor, who had survived the tunnels with a limp he would carry for the rest of his life and no particular interest in discussing it. Devon did not say much, looking at the photograph. He did not need to. Okafor, watching him, only nodded once, the specific, wordless acknowledgement of two people who had come out the other side of something together and did not require language to confirm it had been worth surviving. Sarah Whitlock never fully explained, in any of the interviews that followed her for the rest of her life, how she had held a battalion together through 11 days underground with no promise that emerging would matter at all. She gave, when pressed, some version of the same answer every time, in language that eventually became, across a dozen worlds and a dozen translations, the closest thing humanity had to an epitaph for a war it had never expected to survive, let alone be remembered for. Kaross Dreth requested, and was granted, retirement from active Dominion command within the year, an almost unheard-of choice for a Warmaster of his rank and record. He spent much of the time that followed doing something no prior Vorrin officer of his standing had ever formally undertaken. Correspondence, slow and careful, and mediated by translation lattices that improved, year by year, at carrying nuance neither species had originally built them to hold, with Sarah Whitlock and eventually with Devon Marsh, whose answer in a containment field on a burning colony world Kaross would return to, in his own private writings, more often than any single memory. Of his 2 centuries of service, he never fully resolved, even to himself, whether what he felt toward the species he had once dismissed as fragile was respect, or something closer to grief for 11,000 years of Vorrin children raised in creche arenas to never need to learn what the Third Battalion had never had the luxury of forgetting. The galaxy had mocked human soldiers for the same reason it had never once needed to develop a word for what it eventually watched walk out of the fire, because the Dominion, and every power the Dominion had ever conquered, had built its strength on never having to endure anything it was not first engineered to survive. Humanity had never had that luxury, not for one single day of its entire violent, ordinary, unaugmented history, and had learned, the only way anyone ever truly learns it, that a species built from nothing but the daily practice of getting up anyway does not require perfect bodies or borrowed courage to remain standing. It only requires refusing, over and over, for as long as it takes, to lie back down. The fire had not been the test the Dominion believed it was. It had only been the moment the rest of the galaxy finally saw, at last, what humanity had been made of all along.